Hi, this is Andy. We're continuing a series of episodes on the topic of change. Back in episode 339, we talked with Katy Milkman about her book, How to Change, which provided, I think, a lot of helpful insights into the behavioral science of change. But what if you're planning to lead a change initiative? Beyond what Katy brought us from behavioral science, I wanted to bring you a process, something that is practical and memorable and tested across industries. And I'm glad to say, I think I found it. In this episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Gary Lloyd, author of Gardeners, Not Mechanics: How to Cultivate Change at Work. Just from the title, you can get a sense of what Gary's thinking about change. In today's discussion, Gary will share why change initiatives tend to underdeliver. He'll explain why thinking of our work as ecosystems instead of machines is a much better way of approaching change. And we'll talk about how the elements of gardening have remarkable applicability to how we can approach change initiatives ourselves. You know, I'm not a gardener, but I find Gary's approach to be practical for changes that you want to lead at work as well as in your personal life. And I can't wait to share this discussion with you. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to improving our ability to lead and deliver. Each Monday, you get an email from me that can be read in 5 minutes or less. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Let's jump into today's discussion with Gary about his book, Gardeners, Not Mechanics. Gary, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Absolute pleasure. I love the podcast. I'm a regular listener.
Well, hey, thank you. And before we get into the book, I'd love for people to learn more about you, Gary. And, can you think of any influences from your, whether it be family culture or experiences growing up that may have helped form you into somebody who's now deeply passionate about helping people cultivate sustainable change?
Gosh, Andy, I hope the questions get easier after this one. If I go all the way back, I guess I'm a curious individual, and the reason, maybe the reason for that is that my mother was Jewish, which means that I'm Jewish by birth. My father was Catholic, which means I'm Catholic by birth. And so, as a compromise, they packed me off to an Anglican school, which we would call a Church of England school. My mum says that I was baptized. I've never seen any evidence of it, and my mum was a bit fast and loose with the truth sometimes. And I've ended up a Buddhist. So from a really early age, I got different perspectives on the same thing. And that's always intrigued me to go to primary sources and look into things, and why things are the way they are, and really not accept the framing that we're often given. And just then to roll forward a bit until the mid-90s, when I came back from doing a business degree, I inherited a big change program, and found myself leading 12 simultaneous projects. And since that time, I've watched change being done well. I've watched it being done badly. And I just found this a bit frustrating. So given the lockdown, I put pen to paper and put this note in a bottle and sent it out into the ocean.
So glad you did, and I'm glad it showed up on my island because I'm better because of it. Whether it's true or not that 70% of change initiatives fail, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the value expected from change projects is usually overestimated, and the difficulty is generally underestimated. So, how would you describe the predominant approach to change that tends to lead to failed change initiatives?
Well, it kind of goes back to what you said in the introduction, Andy, which is that I believe the organizations, the world of work in general, is like an ecosystem rather than a machine. We'll talk about that in a bit, but it's absolutely clear from the pandemic. I used to have to say to people, do you think the world of work is like an ecosystem, or is it like a machine? And I used to get splits on that. Now everybody goes ecosystem. The interdependence between things, the unpredictability, limits of control, which are the characteristics of an ecosystem, are just absolutely crystal clear. So what's the alternative? It's a machine. Now, what are the characteristics of a machine? Well, the characteristics of a machine are that in a controlled environment, the same inputs produce the same outputs time after time after time. A car is a really interesting machine, actually, and put it in a controlled environment, it does really well. Put it on what we would call a motorway on a highway with a human being behind it and some dodgy weather, and it becomes a bit less like a machine. It becomes more like an ecosystem integrated with all the other drivers, the weather, the road conditions and stuff like that. Now, the machine metaphor, back in 1993, there were a couple of books written about what was called re-engineering, for those that were old enough to remember. And then the seminal book was written by Harvard Business School professor John Kotter. It was called Leading Change. He wrote an article and then he wrote a book. And it is what I would call a big bet approach to change, which is that if you assume that the world is predictable, then you can plan in advance, and then you can just execute your plan like a machine, because you can predict what's going to happen. Now, the interesting thing about Kotter's approach is that he went back and revised his approach in, I'm just looking for my note here, I think 2001, something like that, but nobody kind of noticed. And when I was asked to run a change leadership workshop for some people recently, they said to me, well, you are going to lecture Kotter, aren't you? So Kotter's got his, I think it's 8 steps. It's very much a top-down sequential approach, and it's a zombie idea in my view. It's a view of the world from 1995. I'm not sure how appropriate. Who am I to argue with a Harvard Business School professor? But I don't think that's how the world was then. But CEOs, COOs, or even senior managers coming to an organization with this myth of the first 100 days driving them on, they like to make big bets because they want to make change. And sometimes their tenure isn't that long. So they're not really worried about making lasting change. And there are lots of, there are some examples in the book about this, J.C. Penney being a prime one.
Yeah. What I think was interesting about the J.C. Penney story, and people need to read the book to get it, is it was probably a good idea that other people are maybe looking into now, but it failed in how he implemented it. So it's not that the idea was bad, right? That's what I took from this story.
His idea was absolutely spot. You could see his idea in the UK.
Yeah.
When he was articulating it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that when we have failed change initiatives, it could very well be that it's not that it's a bad idea. It's how we go about doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was just the J.C. Penney one. I hope we're not baffling listeners too much, but it was a huge bet. They just decided to change the way the stores work. I think it was 1,200, 1,100 stores nationwide. And Ron Johnson, who was at the head of that, said he rolled out the Apple stores. He invented the Apple stores together with Steve Jobs. Huge success. And he said at Apple, we didn't test anything, which was completely not true. They tested everything at Apple in small steps. And interestingly, another interesting thing about that story is that Steve Jobs at Apple stayed close to the thing the whole way through. And that's one of the things about being a gardener, which is you don't just dig a hole, put the plant in the ground, walk away and hope it grows. You've got to stay with it. You've got to nurture it, particularly in the early stages. And Ron Johnson at J.C. Penney just didn't do that.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of touched on this now, so let's go into this more about to make sustainable change. Really, a premise of the book is we're more likely to succeed if we approach our changes as gardeners, not mechanics. Okay. So what are some characteristics of ecosystems that make them better from some of the ones you've mentioned about a machine?
Well, I think there are 3 key characteristics of ecosystem. One is unpredictability. Now, human beings in their own right are unpredictable. But then you get interdependence, which I think the pandemic has illustrated very well. Everything from supply chain to vaccination to masks, the whole shooting match. And then the last one is limits of control. There are lots of things that are outside our control. And what the machine approach tries to do is to control unpredictability. It tries to control those things. Now, a gardener accepts that the weather this year may not be like the weather next year. They accept that the soil that they're going to be planting in, if they planted beetroot, again, this is an example from the book, but if they plant beetroot in the same place 2 years running, hell, it's not gonna grow. I don't know about you, Andy, but one of the first things I learned in I can't remember if it was history or geography, was about crop rotation. Right? You don't grow the same thing in the same place. You leave one field fallow. And if we accept that unpredictability is there, we have a conversation about how we're going to explore that unpredictability. We're going to make some assumptions, but we're going to try and test our assumptions as cheaply and as quickly as possible, rather than bet the whole thing, where the only way that you test your assumptions is in 3 years' time, when your project delivers something, and it delivers something, but it doesn't add any value to the organization. And it was really interesting. I mean, you had a guest on, Perry Marshall, I think, who was talking about 80-20. I thought that was really, I really enjoyed that podcast, because often what we don't think hard enough about delivering value. We'll think, and the reason I use the term value is because it's an equation of benefit divided by cost, right? And sometimes that 80 is in the first 20.
Yeah. Perry would be very proud of you bringing that point up. So, but I want to go with something that you mentioned, though, because I think what we often hear, and actually in the J.C. Penney story, he didn't pilot the idea. And I think people use pilot and test market a lot, but you talk about experiments instead of pilots or tests. So what's the advantage of thinking of them as experiments?
The advantage of thinking in terms of experiments is the way that we think about failure. So I've done a lot of the stuff in the book has behavioral science under the covers, and I rarely talk about it explicitly. Hence the reason for resorting to an extended analogy and simile and metaphor. So experimentation automatically in the mind says that failure is not a bad thing. We experiment to find out some information. The thing about a pilot, and believe me, Andy, I've done my fair share of pilots, but generally in a pilot, you set out to prove something. Generally you've got something and you're going to say, we're just going to check if it works. And then the pilot fails and everybody goes, oh no, the pilot has failed. What the hell are we going to do? So it's really about the mindset and the language that we use. We could talk about language a lot, but the language that we use, when we use a word, all these neurons fire in our brain, and each word we have, like experiment, has a huge range of associations with it. As does pilot. That's why, incidentally, a quick takeaway for your listeners, if I may, which is the word imagine is a really, really powerful word when talking about the future, because immediately you ask the question, imagine what it would be like if people's minds just bring up a full color movie, sound, music blasting. It's I think that the power of words is much underestimated in the sort of environment that we're talking about here.
I love that. And like, you could have said, this is from behavioral science, this is from design thinking, this is from lean, but sometimes those words get in the way of the message, and all of a sudden people start shutting down because they feel like it doesn't relate to them. You made this relatable to people. I mean,
that was sorry, Andy, that was the goal, really, because the other thing I've got, as you just alluded to there, I've got a lot of interests that are kind of in there. And one of the things that I've had a long-term interest in is systems thinking and complexity. And I've read a lot of stuff around this, but even if you're the leader, even if you're the leader and you take the time to understand all this stuff and the jargon around systems and complexity, you then go out and you talk to your team and they look at you blankly. So how can you engage in talking about complexity and systems? Well, the way to do that, I believe, is to leverage concepts that people already understand, even if they're not a gardener. And that's why I don't explicitly, as you'll know, mention any of the systems theory or complexity in the book. I just say, think like a gardener, because if you're thinking about a gardener, you are thinking about complexity and systems. That's the deal.
No. I recognize just little clues about the difference between complicated and complex, and and the little things from the lean startup and things like that. But it was in such a way, I felt like it's like Inception, just bringing it in a very spoonful of sugar maybe sort of way. It just makes it easy.
I hate to recommend somebody else's book, but I think the Lean Startup is one of the best project management books ever written. It wasn't written about project management, but it's one of the most valuable things I've ever read. I if you're going to steal from the best.
What is it? R&D is rip off and duplicate, right? So, but even what you reminded us, that asking the question, how can you validate your critical assumptions as quickly and cheaply as possible? That applies to gardening. That applies to projects. That applies in so many different ways. And so it's just an example of some of the ideas that come into play. In fact, you mentioned that no analogy is perfect, right? But if you push it until it breaks, you can gain some insights along the way. So I'm not a gardener per se, but I found this whole analogy to be helpful. And I wasn't familiar with the famed English gardener, Christopher Lloyd, but by reading your book, I think I can recall most of these, right? So check it out. You plan, check me out on this one. So there's a bunch of pieces. You plan, you prepare the soil, you plant, you prune, then there's 2 W's, right? So you weed and water, and then you stake. And then I think it's something like ensure good health and enjoy the harvest. Did I get it?
I think you nailed it.
Yeah.
I think you nailed it.
But that's a good metaphor if it makes it memorable. So let's say someone listening to us is looking to lead a change. So let's start with planning. Okay. We're not going to go through all, but let's start with planning. What are some typical mistakes they should avoid? And what are some of your favorite stories and recommendations for how we can plan with an ecosystem in mind instead of a machine mindset?
Well, we're on a project management podcast or audience to a large extent, and I think I've been running programs and projects since 1994, well, a bit before then, so about 25 years. And generally, if you ask for a plan, you'll see a schedule. Now, not always. I mean, people will produce a weighty document that's got risks and issues in it and scope and stuff like that, and describe that as the plan. If people are doing that, then I think that's really terrific. But what people often don't spend enough time on is what the purpose is and what the vision is, and the shared purpose and the shared vision for the plan. And skimping on those is a false economy. Because those are what I would call the true north of the project. In fact, you've probably heard the quote, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, which comes from the great Prussian strategist von Moltke. But at West Point, they still teach this. And at West Point, they teach the commander's intent. And the commander's intent is what's at the top of the battle plan, because when contact with the enemy happens, you have to know where you're heading. And that's all about, for me, in terms of projects, it's about purpose and vision. And purpose in this instance is expressed for me in 3 different ways, which is could be expressed as a problem, a mission, or a need. I think it's useful, again, playing with the language and the associations to express it in those 3 different ways. Then you go down a level to vision, which for me is a rich picture of what the world is going to look like when our project is delivered. Not a solution, not a vision of the solution, but what the outcome would look like. And you asked about some of the best examples of that. The 2 that come to mind most are the iPhone and the Sony Walkman. And the iPhone one is really interesting because Steve Jobs' brief to the team was to produce a phone that people would love. We can talk about emotion, that the fact that they talked about love, about a phone, at the time sounded idiotic, but he was deadly serious. And he said, you would rather leave your wallet at home than your phone. It allows you to carry the internet in your pocket. Now, if a vision is a rich picture, it doesn't have to be drawn. I do like drawing them, and I do like collaborating by drawing them. But look at what Jobs did there. It's, there's emotion with love. Leave your wallet. Listen, now I just went and paid for my car service with my phone. Now, when Jobs said that didn't exist. That didn't happen. And now to say to somebody that you'd rather leave your wallet at home than your phone, they'd go, yeah, sure. Now, when was the iPhone, Andy? Was it 20 years ago? I don't know.
I think that's right. I think so.
You'd have to go, that seemed like a balmy idea. And you carry it in your pocket. So then you've got a picture. It's brought to life, the whole thing, just using, this goes back to language again, because it's leveraging concepts that we've already got. You can carry it in your pocket. All of a sudden you see a picture of somebody with a phone in your pocket. There are some constraints in that, because it's got to be the size to fit in your pocket. And it's a phone. So there was a constraint there. He could have said a communicator, because at the time there were lots of people experimenting with lots of different ways of communicating. Maybe you tap on your Google glasses and you start talking to somebody. So I think that's a really great example. And there was another one. I don't know if we've got time for it, but back in the day, before MP3 players, people used to play cassettes, and there was no mobile music. I mean, people weren't walking around with whatever it was, 1,000 songs in their pocket. And Sony came out with something called the Walkman, and their vision was described in an advert. And the advert were two young people in shorts carrying a Sony Walkman on roller skates. So it brings to life so much stuff. And to me, that's a really good example of where a plan starts. Doesn't mean you need to do the thing to death, but when things go wrong on a project, you need to know where your true north is. And that's the essence of planning for me.
Something I took away from that section, Gary, is, and it's from the iPhone example, what do we want people to feel? And I think on change initiatives, that's often left on the side. It's like, what do we want people to do? What are maybe the metrics and things like that? But what do we want people to feel? Isn't that brilliant?
It comes from an Apple video. And I know people are hot and cold on Apple, right? Some people listening to this will hate Apple. Some people will love Apple, and there's not a lot in between. But you cannot deny the success of the organization. And there's this short video, you can find it online, and it begins. The first question that we ask is, what do we want people to feel? Now, wouldn't that be a great question to ask about every single project that we start?
Right. So true. I mean, I honestly want that with episodes. Like on a podcast episode, I want them to feel like I'm learning, like it's not boring and things like that. I mean, what if we started a date with Doris? You go out with your wife, and if we, what do I want her to feel like? This idea. And another thing from that section is, to me, this was counterintuitive. What can I get for my budget instead of how much will this cost? Would you mind commenting on that? Because I think
so we're into staking now. So one of the things about staking in a garden is part of it is about support, and part of it is about constraints. So you're saying, what can I do with what I have? If you try and plant, if you take my garden, I can't remember if it's got acidic or, it doesn't matter, alkaline soil. But if I want to try and grow an azalea and my soil is mud, it's just going to die. I could spend a lot of time digging in different types of soil so that an azalea will prosper in my garden. But in the end, stuff's going to seep in, acidity is going to seep in, or alkaline is going to seep in from other places. And it's just going to be a really, really, I nearly said a wrong word there. It's going to be a really, really difficult task to get that plant to grow. This is no different to a project. When we're thinking about the garden, we're asking about, here's a lesson from Darwin, what will fit within our ecosystem? What will fit within our garden? Do we really want to go to the struggle of planting something as beautiful as it may be and putting in all that work to trying to make it grow, knowing that in the end it may fail? So we've got a much higher degree of success in thinking about change if we think about what our ecosystem looks like first, in terms of the people, the processes, everything in it, and then fit becomes a design criteria. We don't create a change and then say, how do we fit it to our ecosystem? How do we get the buy? How do we get buy-in? I hate that term. How do we get buy-in? Because it implies we're doing something to other people, that we're not a participant in the change ourselves, which we are, by the way. Because so often to effect change, we need to reflect on our own assumptions and behavior as much as other people's. So a really good thing to do is to say, okay, here's our ecosystem. What will fit best within our ecosystem? It may not be the thing that we consider to be the most optimum, but what if the most optimum thing, the azalea, won't grow?
That's so good. And, I got to tell you, Gary, early in my career, I'd hear people say, we need to socialize this idea. And I remember in my youthful ignorance thinking, that sounds like a waste of time. Yeah. And your next step in the gardening metaphor after the plan is to prepare the soil. And a major lesson I took from that section is the importance of tackling the most significant risks first instead of the easiest stuff. Because sometimes people go, let's go after the low-hanging fruit, right? Something like that. Tell us what you mean by this idea of tackling the most significant risks first. And what else comes to mind with preparing the soil?
Well, I think to a certain extent, we've covered it already, Andy, in terms of assumptions about why this project, why are we doing this project, and not waiting till the end to find out whether those assumptions are valid or not. And we can do that by doing all sorts of things, running surveys, running experiments. And a survey is an experiment, finding out what people's behavior might be like, running small scale experiments of things. There's usually a way of doing it. So that would be the key thing for me. But also it is I've seen on so many projects it's just, I can't articulate it better than you already did, which is that people leave the hard stuff right till the end, the biggest risk stuff, because it's hard and they just keep putting it off. Tackle it first, because that may be the single point of failure of your project.
I think one of my favorite stories in that section, and it would be tough to pick one because there were many good ones, but the person who was looking to get promoted, and well, actually, it was you, I think, who didn't prepare the soil, but then there was somebody else who did prepare the soil. And so the idea is that this can also be a change where you're trying to help your career, but are you developing the relationships that you need to? Do I remember that? I mean,
right? there are different ways of thinking about preparing the soil, such as enriching the soil and stuff like that. One of the key ones that resonates for me is people and relationships. It was me. I failed to get promoted because I hadn't prepared the soil. I hadn't been around. I didn't realize how the process worked well enough, and I hadn't essentially been around to do the lobbying to get my bill passed. Now that became really useful when I was coaching a business school student who was trying to get on the board of his company. So he was a pretty senior guy, and I told him about my experience, and out of that he went around and he said, I asked him who makes the decision about whether you get to the board, and he said the CEO. And I said, have you talked to the CEO about it? And they hadn't. They were too scared. They wanted to leave it to last because they didn't want to look like a fool. And then I said, who's the next person after the CEO? And they said, it's the CFO. CFO is always the next person. Whoever it is, you need the finance director on side. Always have them on side. So those two people are two people to test out the feasibility of the idea in the very first place. Because if you leave them to go and talk to the rest of the board, and they'll all say nice things, but in the end, when it comes to a decision, all the people in the boardroom are going to look across to the CEO. The CEO is going to look at the CFO, and if they say, yeah, I think that's a good idea, then they'll go with it. Yeah. And that sort of thing will be applicable to any environment where who influences the influencers, right? Who influences the influencers? Yeah. And you can draw that as a picture, like a mind map or something like that, and say, who are the people we really need to convince on this, or who are the people, or better still, who are the people we need to understand? I think, I can't remember if I put it in the book, but whenever I do a project, I go and seek out somebody that I call Beardy Baldy Bob. Now, Beardy Baldy Bob was on a project that I once worked on, and he complained about everything, and he was just like throwing rocks at the project endlessly. And I realized that Beardy Baldy Bob had a point. And as a consequence, ever since then, I go and seek out the naysayers. And one, they influence other people. And if you can turn around the view of a naysayer by listening to them, not by battering with your logic, but understanding why they think what they think. One, they normally have a point. Two, if you listen to them and learn something, and they become an advocate, well, boy, are they great advocates.
Yeah, that's a great lesson. Let's jump to pruning. I mean, what are some of your favorite examples of how pruning applies to our change initiatives?
I mentioned earlier, I had a program that I inherited, had 12 projects running simultaneously. I was lucky. I won't go into the detail, but I had a guardian angel who came from the Boston Consulting Group. Thank you, Boston Consulting Group. You were brilliant, Paul Mitchell. If you're listening to this, thank you so much. You saved my life. It was a challenge. It was a challenging time, and I had these 12 projects which I inherited. They had about a spend of roughly $1 million each on IT, and the guy that I went to work for, I was going to be his second in command, but he'd been pushed to some higher job. So I took over his job unexpectedly, and he got out a spreadsheet with the 12 projects on it and how much each project was going to save, and how it was going to move the customer service index. And at the bottom, there was a number. Can't remember what it was at the moment. It was about 20 million per annum. It was a retail bank. So it was a pretty big operation. If you knock a bit out of a process in the retail bank and do that across 1,000 branches, you can save quite a lot of money, or cut postal costs and stuff like that. Okay. And somebody from BCG came up to me. No, I don't need any help. I'm fine. I said, hot shot, but just back from business school. Right. My sphincter was being challenged, to be quite honest. But and then somebody else who was actually very bright from the IT department, who was seconded in there, said, Gary, you know that a lot of these projects are dud. They're never gonna. Oh yeah, I forgot to say that the guy that I inherited the program for just said that bottom right hand corner of the spreadsheet, that's what you're going to be measured on. And that's how your reputation within this organization is going to be measured, on whether you deliver that number. So anyway, cut a long story short, what my guardian angel taught me was that people only worried about the number in the bottom right hand corner, and actually we effectively killed 7 of the 12 projects, but we planted some new ones. So two of the most difficult things with projects that I've found is starting them and stopping them. Once a project is underway and people's there's some virility involved and some reputation involved, it's quite hard to stop them. But that was a real lesson to me, of a mindset to say, focus on the value that we're trying to deliver. We have 12 projects. Actually, people don't care too much about which projects are which. There may be some people that are waiting for are expecting some of them but we were quite brutal about the pruning. You know, if you take a chainsaw to a rose bush, it grows pretty well afterwards. And sometimes you have to get out that chainsaw. This goes back to the 80-20 again, and say, do you know where your value lies? And sometimes you've just got to go back, look at it, prune back to the stuff that's really going to deliver you the highest value, and say, okay, fine. Is that going to deliver us all of the value? If not, is there something else we need to plant?
So much to think about in that section. You know, there's a quote attributed to Deming that says there are two basic rules of life. One, change is inevitable. And two, everybody resists change. When you're faced with opposition or fear to a change, you know, what do you personally, Gary, try to remember and do?
Well, it depends on where you come into the change. If those of us that have worked as a consultant, sometimes, so the ideal is that you're in a change at the beginning. It's not always the case, is it? But if you're in a change at the beginning, then the way to go is co-creation. So the people that are affected by the change are involved in shaping it and helping to deliver it. The participants of the change. If you're further down and you come in, let's say as a consultant, and they say this is the change, you have to help deliver it, then you may have inherited a design, but that doesn't mean it can't be changed. And the key thing there comes back to Beardy Baldy Bob for me, which is it's about listening to people. And people say, you know, sometimes you have people say, I love change. And I say, nobody loves change. Evolution has programmed us to be very, very cautious about change. And we need to understand what people are going through when they're affected by a change. And we're back to emotions, aren't we, Andy? You know, what are people feeling? Are they fearful? If they're fearful, why are they fearful? What assumptions are they making? Can we talk about those assumptions? Do they have a really good point? Or do they have some false perceptions that we can talk about? So it's all about conversations and listening. All too often, however, people say, oh, you know, we have to do a consultation exercise, or we should listen. Of course we should listen. You know, this is the number one competence of a leader. But if you're going to listen, you've got to hear, and you've got to act on what you hear.
I think of your opening comments about how you feel like you grew up as a curious person. I feel like curiosity is the ultimate hack here. Like, I really want to understand why Beardy Baldy Bob or whoever it is feels this way. And I think you said something along the lines of it was something about the best way to acknowledge fear is empathy. I think it was something like that. Like,
well, that goes. We get into so this is really interesting territory, because I learned a huge amount from a guy called Chris Voss. And Chris Voss used to be the chief international FBI hostage negotiator. Now, what can that person teach people that are involved in projects? Well, people might already be going quite a lot, actually. You know, we've had some hostages. But what I learned from Chris Voss is the way that he gets hostages to be released is through empathy. And Chris Voss, I don't have it to hand, he's got a great definition of empathy, but it's something along the lines of when you really step into somebody else's world and understand how they see it, that's when you're really expressing empathy. Chris Voss, interesting character. He went to Harvard to the negotiation project to do a course to learn how to negotiate better, and he ended up running the course.
That's great. I love it. There's so much more we could talk about, but let me end with this. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. What's something parents could do to help develop some of these ideas in their children?
Well, never blame a flower for not growing. For a start. In the book, I quote Carol Dweck and a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. I've struggled against the fixed mindset my whole life. You know, I believe that, you know, and kids are often told they're good at maths, bad at maths, good at art, bad at art, good at sport, bad at art. That's a fixed mindset. We teach children from an early age that they're good at something or bad at something, rather than experiment. Try that. It didn't work. What did you learn from it? Let's try again. In Dweck's book, she talks about saying to a child that's found a maths problem very easy, saying to them, I'm really sorry that was too easy for you. Let me give you something more difficult the next time. So for parents, if people don't know about fixed, it's a really interesting thing, because when I talk to people about fixed versus growth mindset, I love it. They go, yeah, of course I have a growth mindset, you know, and then you look down the criteria, yeah, I'm all that, and you know, I'm not. I find it difficult. I fail at something, or it doesn't go as I plan. Is that about my identity, or was it about that task? Yeah. Well, it was about that task. I hope I'm not doing too badly because I'm aware of it. But for me, that would be the biggest thing, which is the people need to be allowed the space to. I'm hesitating because I don't want to use the word fail, but things don't quite turn out as they like. And say, well, you know, that's a learning experience, and blame is just a terrible ingredient in any recipe, I think.
You said it a couple of times in the book, but our identity is often based on the stories we tell ourselves. And I think as a parent, we need to keep that in mind too. What are we reinforcing the fixed mindset without even realizing? I'm like, well, you're not good at that. I mean, just simple little things like that we maybe even somehow with good intentions might be saying.
Yeah. You say to the child, oh, well, maybe you're not good at that. Let's try this. Yeah. Rather than, oh, maybe that wasn't explained to you well. Let's find a different way of looking at it. There's some really interesting stuff from, I don't know, do you know the Khan Academy, K-A-H-N?
Sure. Yeah, our kids use it a lot.
So the Khan Academy, Sal Khan said that what they found, because everything's electronic, right? So it's all digital, so they can view people's progress. And in the Khan Academy, with maths in particular, they often found that the kids that struggled early on were the best in the long term, if they had a growth mindset.
Yeah, sure.
But the kids that often did really well, this was true of me. At school, I was great at maths until I wasn't. And then that was part of my identity. I said, I've reached the limits of my math capability. What a self-limiting belief that was to impose on myself. Unbelievable.
And it all ties into change and parenting and ourselves. You know, I got to tell you, I mean, for those listening, I can't tell you how much I personally benefited from Gary's book. If you're looking for a practical guide to leading change, whether at work and in your personal life, get a copy of Gary Lloyd's book, Gardeners, Not Mechanics. And I want to mention, Gary, in addition to your book, there's some additional ways that people can learn about your work, right?
Yeah, well, we're launching, I'm launching a workshop in February. It's going to be across 6 weeks of people working together, using the ideas in the book as a framework for thinking about a change which is important to them and working on it. And that workshop, because it's the very first iteration of that workshop, I'm going to limit it to just 12 people on that, working with me and working together over 6 weeks, a number of online sessions, essentially working through the book on real stuff and collaborating with other people involved in change to get different perspectives. Because being open to different perspectives and being prepared to let go of ideas is one of the most powerful things we can do.
Yeah, I put links to the book and Gary's website in the show notes for this cast. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Pleasure. It's been fun. Thanks, Andy.